Hi folks. Today we continue in our series on the 7 deadly sins, these afflictions that prevent us from fully embracing life and our life in God. I want to start by just beginning to read you some encouraging words of Scripture from Isaiah chapter 40, beginning with verse 27. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, that my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. God does not faint or grow weary. God's understanding is unsearchable. God gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. May this be the word of the Lord into your heart this day. In our Bible study, we've been looking at the very earliest writings of Paul. In particular, we've been looking at the earliest manuscript that we have of what Christianity was all about, and that's 1 Thessalonians. And the lesson that we're learning over and over again is that it was a Christianity, then called the Way, as it erupted into society, was radical. I mean, it was a huge alternative, a values alternative to Hellenistic culture, and which Christianity really was planted and grew and grew and grew. Well, it grew so much that about 300 years later, so we're talking now the mid to the late 300s, Christianity began to become acceptable to empire. And when it became acceptable to empire, it began to lose some of its countercultural message and its countercultural values. It began to be absorbed so that, well, what is the difference between a Christian and just someone who was raised in Hellenistic culture? In some senses, much like today, what's the difference between a Christian and an American? It was a crisis back in the early time of the church. And so what happened was, as Christianity was being absorbed into the empire, what we have now named the desert mothers and fathers, monks, essentially, people who wanted to cultivate a life of prayer and integrity, they withdrew from society. They withdrew and went into the desert, away from society. And they went there for their own spiritual discernment and their own spiritual advancement. We Methodists call it the process of sanctification. And they did it not just for themselves, but they were doing it on behalf of God, on behalf of the world. They believed that by withdrawing, they could cultivate practices that would help not just themselves experience God, but us as well. And one of the techniques, if you will, one of the benefits that came out of the desert, some of the wisdom that came out of the desert, was that the experience of the monks themselves, and this is male and female, began to become, in my opinion, the first psychologists. They began to really probe the human soul and human motivation. And in part of probing the human soul and the human motivation, they began to probe the patterns in our life that prevent us from being fully ourselves created in the image of God, ourselves as compassionate, caring, cooperative beings, ourselves as folks who can love in an agape style, can love selflessly. And they began to compile lists of common afflictions, common temptations that happened to them as individuals. And again, they saw the pattern in all of them, in both in the monastic movement and even in those who lived as hermits. They eventually, this list of these patterns that they began to notice in themselves became known to us as the 7 deadly sins. These afflictions would manifest as arrogance and an anger that really bordered on wrath, and greed and gluttony and lust and envy, and something called ACEDIA. Through the years, ACEDIA became popularly known as sloth and was associated with laziness, the equivalent, really, of sitting on a couch with a bag of Doritos and binging Netflix. Now, personally, I would like to drop the word sloth. I don't find it very helpful, and I don't find it to be descriptive of what the desert mothers and fathers were talking about. I'd like to change the word sloth back to its original monastic word, ACEDIA. Because ACEDIA carried the meaning of continually being distracted, but it also had deeper meanings that got at the nub of why we are so easily and willingly distracted in life. That nub was a spiritual affliction that showed itself as a lack of care, an unfocused boredom, a weariness about life, an inner emptiness, a perpetual sorrow that just wouldn't let go. ACEDIA is something that I think most of us are experiencing in this continuous pandemic. Most of us are struggling to see the light, to feel on a daily basis the compassionate presence, to muster up encouraging hope, to rise in the morning in the expectation that this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Rather than this, we're experiencing a heavy repetitiveness, each day plodding along like the day before. There's a dreary weariness about tomorrow, fear that it will be the same as today. And so far from faith and hope and love defining our inner attitudes, our inner moods, we're more in the mode of endure. Just endure. Just endure. And for 5 months, we've been enduring. And we have been running on our spiritual reserves. But our tank is beginning to get a little empty. And some of us are just drawing on our last fumes, and we don't know where new energy is going to come from. If we spend any time at all in our interior life, our subjective life, our feelings and our thoughts, our dreams and desires, we find ourselves exerting pressure to push down anxiety and fear and panic and exhaustion. But that's only for those who even try to spend time in their interior lives. down in the basement of their life. The vast majority of us don't even bother. We don't even go there. We avoid that basement. Doritos and binging Netflix are far easier. ACEDIA isn't the result of something that we've done. It's not a punishment. It's not a logical consequence of actions left undone. Rather, ACEDIA is a spirituality. It's a mood. It's a gloomy presence that invades our life. It just moves into our life and like a virus, and it begins to affect all parts of our life. We can't just will it away. It's a presence. It's an unwelcome but persistent intruder who moves into our interior life and sets up house. Now, ACEDIA, just like those other deadlies, lust and greed and anger and so on, these are common afflictions. The desert and mothers and fathers set up practices, a rule of life, if you will, an ordered structure to their day as a means to help combat the effect that each of the deadlies have on an individual. And what they discovered was that each of the 7 deadly sins, wound up having a life of their own. It was as if each sin was a very conscious little demon that was constantly probing and attacking and trying to take over the will of the person. For example, the monks could protect themselves against gluttony through a disciplined and restricted diet, only to find that gluttony would then manifest itself in a different form than food. But that ravenous hunger, that bottomless pit that cannot be filled, was still there. ACEDIA was the same way. The monks could devise rigorous schedules of activities reinforced by memorization of scripture texts full of compassion, and even further reinforced by daily prayers and acts of mercy. But ACEDIA, the dreary weariness, the gloomy presence, the feeling that nothing really matters, it continued to pop up in one's thoughts and attitudes and actions. Often, it would take a very negative turn into cynicism and nihilism, causing enormous psychological breakdown in the monk who was living this public life of obedience, but this inner life of emptiness. These common afflictions affect all of us to some degree. Each of us has a little bit of ACEDIA in us. In a metaphorical way, the monks were right. The 7 deadlies are like little active demons that are conscious and that they seek us out. Or maybe more to the point of today, they're like a virus, constantly seeking to attach itself to us and to take control incrementally, step by step, throughout our whole life. In its wisdom, the universal church created an antidote to the virus. And for the most part, in most people, the antidote worked, does work, has continued to work. Maybe it doesn't eradicate the affliction, but at least helps us to manage it, to control it. In other words, most of us have dealt with ACEDIA in our life, and certainly in this pandemic. Most of us, have eaten that bag of Doritos and have been binge watching something or another as an escape from our anxiety, an escape from our exhaustion at the end of every day. And there's nothing wrong with that until you find yourself doing it 5 nights out of 7. And then the other 2 nights, you find that although you're not eating Doritos, you're eating popcorn. And even though you're not binge watching Netflix, you start watching church videos over and over and over again. ACEDIA is an intruder that enters our house whether or not we welcome it. In its wisdom, the universal church has created a way of life that helps us orient away from ACEDIA's influence. It's like wearing the mask that offers a little protection against COVID. It isn't foolproof, it isn't 100%, but it does help. It does offer protection. Against ACEDIA, the universal church teaches its members the need for and the goal of faith. And the word that I prefer to use when I think of faith is trust. Who and what do I really trust? Who's my go-to person? What can I rely on? As Christians, we're continually taught and retaught, we're oriented and reoriented towards a fundamental trust in God, a God who is defined by acts of love and compassion and care, a God who knows our name and who's willing to be with us in the story of life. In other words, not an unmoved mover out there who's observing us, but a presence that has moved into our life and not only watches, but it becomes a part of our life in a benevolent way, not a threatening way. What this means fundamentally is that life is good, that we can expect something good in every situation. We can expect possibility even when we can't see it, even when the door slams shut. So what we get taught about faith, about trust, is to expect the unexpected, to expect that which we can barely believe in. In a world that tempts us mightily towards cynicism and nihilism and exhaustion, a sense of meaninglessness, the Christian is pointed towards a purpose larger than oneself, a purpose larger than one's present situation, a purpose larger than life. And so for me personally, I trust the idealism of Christian faith that God will be all in all. I don't know what that means, but I think it at least means there are capacities of compassion and mercy and care and companionship and restoration in every situation, even our current one of cultural chaos, of political atrophy, and this pandemic. And such trust helps me, like the mask helps, to look for what I'm not seeing, to look for who I'm not seeing, and to look for what is not there, but could be, if only. The church has also taught us to embody a Eucharistic life. In other words, what community beyond your own biological family are you identifying with? Are you a part of? Do you contribute to? The church teaches us that we're not isolated individuals, but we're a body of interdependent parts. This really came home to me last week when Harold died. To simply be around Sherry, our elder, and draw so much strength from the integrity of how she faces her life, how she loved Harold, how she stood by Harold, how she fought for Harold's health, and how she released Harold when he passed from this temporal time to eternal time. To be part of a community that goes from cradle to grave, of young ones and elders and all those in between. This is such a gift to be part of a relational community of the generations. It is a gift that generates power and presence and spirit, and it generates hope and love and courage inside us simply by being a part of it. Our Eucharistic life, our faith in God, cannot stop the virus. It doesn't stop the virus from wanting to live despite how deadly that is for us. But our Eucharistic life and faith in God can help us be more like Sherry, navigating the pitfalls and tragedies of life. In reference to ACEDIA, being part of a community both larger and different than your own biological family offers you helpmates. It enlarges your life. It gives you examples. It gives you possibilities, strategies, certainly beyond Doritos and binge watching Netflix. And thirdly, the church offers the practices of a baptized life. What separates the human animal from the other animals is this: we are the creatures who create meaning. We are the creatures who transcend our instincts and live through symbols. We're the creatures who, knowing that we will one day die, nevertheless ask why. We're the creatures with a vibrant, active, crucially definitive inner life of subjectivity. And the church has given us practices that help us explore this deep inner life, this inner subjectivity. Our baptism is an indoctrination and an identification with the life of Jesus himself, a nobody in the world, whom God vindicated from the grave and pronounces, follow him, follow that pattern. Follow that example of consciousness and compassion. Our baptized life counsels us to develop ourselves from the inside out through spiritual techniques like prayer and meditation and journaling, artistic expression, biblical study, daily devotion. It is a desire to know the heart of that which you desire. A life disciplined and oriented in spiritual and by spiritual practices and interior introspection is a mask that helps protect us from having ACEDIA take over our life and our will. These three, trusting in a benevolent personal source of loving kindness that is offered to you continually, participating in the Eucharist life of a community and, dare I say, congregational relationships, developing a baptismal life of spiritual practices that help you explore the basement of your life. These three are essential, foundational, crucial in combating the virus of the intruder, ACEDIA, and all of the deadly sins. But what if you've already been deeply infected? What if right now you're eating Doritos and exhaustively watching this video because, well, why not? What else do I have to do? What if right now you've been caught by ACEDIA and it has started taking over your will? What if it has already atrophied your desires? What if it's already taken away your hope? Let me close with three simple and practical things that you might try this week. These three things, maybe just choose one. Just try and see if it might have some antibodies to counteract the intruder ACEDIA. And the first, and I know it's a big step really, is to get up off the couch and walk outside your door. Go for a walk around the block, or go out into your yard or a nearby park. Just Get out of the house. Go outside into creation. Move your body in some form of exercise, even if it's just strolling around the block. The benefit of being outside is that there are healing forces in the smell of a flower, in the sway of trees, in the properties of lakes and streams, in the flight of birds. Creation is a far better screen than Netflix and can awaken your entire body. It can get you out of your head and into your senses. Secondly, don't worry about praying, especially if you find that you're not praying or you can't pray. If ACEDIA has you, you probably aren't praying because your brain is overwhelmed to the point of numbness. So just sit. Just breathe. Nothing else. Just breathe. Just find 10 minutes, 20 minutes to your day and do nothing. Then simply breathe in and out. You don't have to pray with words or images. You don't have to do anything. Just simply breathe. Nothing else but breathing in and out. I would encourage you once again to go outside and sit and breathe. Certainly look out a window and sit and breathe. You'll be surprised at how relaxing and how healing this refreshment can be. And you know, seriously, prayer has many forms. And it's not like God doesn't know what you're going through. It's more like you don't know what you're going through. And simply sitting 10 minutes, 20 minutes, doing nothing else but breathing can often unclog the frozen and numbed out brain. And third, call up somebody and chat. And chat about nothing. Chat about Doritos or Netflix or breathing. Just talk to somebody that isn't you, that doesn't live with you. Get outside yourself. And if you have no one else to talk with, call me. I'm your pastor. Sometimes I'm useful. At least with this deadly, I have a lot of practice with this ACEDIA stuff. I know it well. ACEDIA is the unwelcome intruder of the soul. But there are ways to cast it out. There are ways to even wear a mask to protect yourself. You're not alone. Go outside. Sit and breathe. Just chat. Amen.